So, Doug, mental toughness does matter, but how do you describe what mental toughness is and why is it so important?
Well, that's a great question, Penny. The first thing to understand, I suppose, is it's an aspect of your personality. I don't think people quite understand that. They just think it's some magic box of tricks that is somehow going to say something about you. But it's actually fundamentally important because it's addressing an aspect of your personality that we've always known to be important, but it's an invisible aspect of your personality. And so it's that aspect that explains how you respond mentally, that is, in your head, when things happen to you and around you. Now, most of the time when we talk about personality and the way we react to things, we're talking about our behavior, so how we act. And that's a useful way of looking at things. But actually, how we act is not the first thing that happens when something happens to us. Our first response is a mental one. And the significance of that is it affects how we act. And so if we really want to change something, if we want to develop something, yeah, we can do it through looking at behavior, but actually it's much more effective to be able to go back to the root source of that behavior and say, well, let's see how the individual is approaching things mentally. Let's see if we can change that. And we can, because what we do, Penny, is, as you know, very well know, is rooted in real science. It's rooted in sound psychological theory. There are more than 250 research papers that either support the concept or the measure. So what some of those are telling us is that mental toughness is partly genetic. In other words, some of it is inherited, but some of it is experiential. In other words, we've learned how to develop some aspects of our personality to a degree. That has got a number of implications. Firstly, it means we can develop it, but only if we understand it. And that's where the magic happens. Because the very clever people that we work with, people like Professor Clough and Professor John Perry, have done some very clever research and have been able to establish that actually mental toughness isn't one thing. It's actually a composite of a number of things. And they found that it's a composite of four big elements that each have sub-elements. So we now know mental toughness consists of 8 factors. So these are 8 factors that we're going to explore hopefully in other podcasts. So that means that we can understand our mental responses to a fine level of detail. And that's, again, where another level of magic happens. Because what we're really doing is we're really stretching our understanding of the way people respond. We are beginning to push back boundaries, and we're actually beginning to knock over some old ideas. Because we're very used to looking at things like personality in terms of types or labels or colors even, and that can be, it's like a game rather than a real explanation. What we're now able to do is to get to a real explanation. So when we talk about 8 factors, yeah, we've got 8 individual pieces of information about somebody, but the interesting thing about it is that those 8 factors are both independent and they're connected through this common theme. Now, that's going to be quite an obscure idea for people, but let's go straight to the bottom line. It means that there are at least 40,000 combinations of those 8 factors. In other words, you could have 40,000 people in a room and every single one will be subtly different. And that is beginning to look at the holy grail of understanding people and developing them. Because in the past, we've been doing things like adopting one-size-fits-all approaches. But an interesting piece of research that came out in 2023 from Oxford University, when it looked at 143 resilience and well-being programs in 143 UK companies, one of the things they found was that actually none of them worked. And in fact, some of them did more harm than good.
Wow.
And what they found were two important things. One is, although the people attending these programs were individuals, what we weren't seeing is personalization. In other words, if you were working for me, Penny, and I noticed that you were going through a bit of a tough time, I might say, well, hang on, Penny, I'm going to get you a coach, or I'm going to put you on a little course that might help. That's fine. That's a nice thing to do. But if I don't work out exactly why Penny is struggling, I'm not really doing a good job. And this idea of personalizing training or development is crucial, because if you went to see a doctor and said, I'm not feeling well, and the doctor said, okay, you're not feeling well, here's some tablets, you really wouldn't get very far. It's the same in development. We need to understand exactly what's going on with people. And what we now have is that capability of being able to understand to a very fine degree what's happening inside people. And that enables us then to do some really, really interesting things, like develop them, like, and I think the other thing that we can do is we can use it to bring people on board. So in other words, we can create self-awareness. And I think what we're understanding through our work is that self-awareness is the really interesting bit. We talk about self-awareness all the time, but we don't often know what that actually means. So when we talk about self-awareness, very often we're talking about understanding what we see. But what we can now do is create self-awareness about what we can't see. And we've got a snappy name for that, making the invisible visible. And once we can get people to understand what it is about them that holds them back or helps them to do things, we've got a really good, strong basis for being able to help them to become the best version of themselves that they can be. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it's about.
It is a
In a big
nutshell.
nutshell.
I mean, I speak about mental toughness all over the place, and for organisations, is it not a bit of a big ask to deal with everyone in an organisation as an individual? Because that would seem like too big a task. Is that a possibility in your mind?
No, it isn't. I mean, it's perfectly possible. I mean, it's a cultural thing. I think we're touching here about a related subject about how we motivate and how we develop people. In the past, we've tended to use, again, a one-size-fits-all approach. We tend to use extrinsic motivation to bring people on board, and we say, well, let's have a salary structure. If we pay people well and we pay people properly, they'll be motivated. Well, we all know that pay and works for some people, but for most people, they get a pay increase and 3 weeks later they've forgotten it. It's not particularly motivating them. But what we now know is that if we attend to people in a different way, if we kind of give them a purpose, we give them autonomy, we make sure that they're competent at what they do, and we give them an environment in which they can flourish, then that's exactly what happens. They flourish and they enjoy it, and they enjoy it day in, day out. And mental toughness is a big part of that. So we know that we can do that, but that's really about impacting on culture. So you're making a good point here. So I started talking about individuals, but actually it's just as valuable from an organizational perspective.
Yeah. So self-awareness is the basis, and of course our how we respond to things is also, isn't it not situational? So if I get annoyed by mess in my house, I might have a word with people. If I get annoyed with mess in an office, I sort of have a different approach. So my response is the same, but my behavior is different. What's your thoughts on that?
No, I think you've got it in a nutshell there. And again, this is illustrating, we spend a lot of time looking at behavior, and people will say, but I behave differently at home than I do at work. And you do. And so mental toughness is part of the rest of you. There are other factors. So you're quite right. If somebody annoys me at home, I'm more likely to lose it a bit and shout and maybe use the odd piece of bad language. But I know I can get away with it at home. I go into the workplace and exactly the same incident happens. I button it. because I know that if I offend people, I'll end up in a disciplinary process. So I'm really modifying my mental responses according to the circumstances I find myself in, but my
Yeah.
mental responses are not any different.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And mental responses in organizations as well. I've spoken at sales conferences where they've announced, the massive new targets for the business. And the guy or the lady making the announcement is assuming that this is going to get everybody fired up and excited, and not knowing that not everyone thinks the same way they do. And some people are really switched off by it, and everyone will respond to the same information in quite a different way. And the leader might then be quite confused why everyone hasn't sort of risen to the challenge, because there's so many assumptions made, isn't there, in corporate life?
There are, and I think that's a legacy from the old way of thinking. If you go back in history, and I start in history, Penny. When I first started working, there was something called scientific management. People believed that if I told you something and told you clearly enough, then you would understand it and you would comply. And people used to talk about obedience at work. I've not heard that phrase used for donkey's years.
Yeah.
Now, what we assume is if I tell you what we're trying to do, you'll be smart enough, and that's really what we're trying to do. You'll be smart enough to work out how you can contribute to that,
Right.
because you're actually the expert. You are doing the actual job. I'm sat 20 levels above you. I don't know what you're doing minute by minute, when you're
Yeah.
doing your job. And my trick is to switch you on so that you understand how to connect with everybody else in your organization and contribute to the purpose. My job is to sell you the purpose, not to tell you how to do
Yeah.
your job in detail.
Yeah. And for me, that's the piece of leadership that self-awareness of leaders is sometimes missing, and is critical to the success of an organization, in my mind.
So sometimes, yeah, you're absolutely right, Penny. We talk about mental toughness, and you use a really nice way of describing mental toughness. You talk about it being where resilience and positivity come together.
Yeah.
Now, that's exactly right, because what you're actually describing there is not just at an individual level, that matters, but at an organizational level. I don't know of any organization that doesn't want its organization to be resilient, to be able to roll with the punches.
Yeah.
Because there always are punches. And I don't know of any organization that doesn't want to be positive or optimistic about what the future holds. So if you can bring those two together, you have a real chance of thriving. Now, so that's a cultural issue. So the challenge for leaders is to understand how to develop that culture. And the way you develop that culture is you do it top down. The people at the top have got to really believe in this. They've really got to have the mental toughness, the mindset to be able to make it happen. And then they've got to create that mindset progressively down the organization. And that's the way you reach the individual employee, even in the largest organization. And I've seen that happen before, so it can be done. But Penny, you've got loads and loads of experience, particularly you've got life experiences. So you're very eloquent about mental toughness. How do you see mental toughness?
Well, I haven't, in this episode, I'm not going to share too much, because I think that I'll share more in further episodes. But I think I've been developing, as probably every single person on the planet has, we develop mental toughness as you grow up. I hadn't realized the rate at which I'd been developing it, and I didn't know it was a thing. It was only when I met AQR and you, and I discovered the mental toughness concept, and everything fell into place. And I thought, this is the first time I sort of understand me. So I grew up in a very dysfunctional, weird family where I always felt out of control. And I grew up with a desperation to have some control of my life, because I knew that it was down to me. No one was going to sort my life out except me. And that sort of, in hindsight, was enormously helpful to me, because most situations I get into, I need to understand for myself how I can gain as much control of this mission or this project or whatever challenge I'm doing. And also because of the life that I led, I grew resilience. I had to bounce back. I had no other choice. No one was going to pick me up. I had to bounce back. So I was also driven through my childhood by a very strong purpose. And I think that's enormously helpful for developing mental toughness, because when you do have setbacks, which you will, if your purpose is really strong, almost the way through stuff becomes relatively easy, straightforward, because you're so driven by the purpose. And I hope at some point we'll talk more about purpose, because for a lot of people, I don't think they really reflect on why are we here, what's it all about, what matters. But I think some reflection on that can be very useful. But I've always loved a challenge. I like pushing myself. I am the weird one who likes getting out of my comfort zone, who likes stretching myself, who likes pushing myself. I'm not sure. I always thought, you see, most people thought like me. And then I grew up and realized, actually, most people don't. This is not how everyone thinks. And that was my silly assumption for most of my life, that everyone thought like me. And thankfully, they don't. So having discovered the mental toughness concept, it's made so much clear to me, but it also gives me the ability to help other people to see things more clearly, which I know is what you get great satisfaction from as well. But on some levels, I'm quite mentally tough, and on some, I'm incredibly mentally sensitive. So I'm a mixed bag. All human beings are complex, aren't they? And I've never asked you actually about your mental toughness and how you consider yourself in those terms.
Well, that's a really good a couple of points to bring in. I mean, addressing my mental toughness, I probably score high on every scale, with one exception, and that's emotional control, but that's not particularly low either. And that's the interesting thing about this is, and the interesting thing about listening to you is that the mental toughness concept has helped to explain to you what your mindset is.
Yeah.
You've done this before you've achieved what you've done. Before you ever knew about mental toughness, it explains it.
Yeah.
And you brought out an interesting point. There's a risk that when we talk about mental toughness, we kind of present an idea that everybody has to be mentally tough, or that being mentally tough is good. That's actually not the case. It's self-awareness that's important. In fact, almost everybody that we come across is a mixture of mentally tough factors and mentally sensitive factors. And it's even more nuanced than that. It is perfectly possible to be mentally tough and fail. You obviously haven't failed.
Well, there's plenty I've failed at, I assure you.
But we often see people who get to the top of an organization. This is very common when we work with senior leadership teams. The qualities that get them to the top, that drive, that determination, and that ability to take risks, when it gets them to the top, are often the qualities that trip them up, because they turn around, they expect that everybody else in the organization, your phrase, to be like them and to have the same sort of mindset, and they don't.
Yeah.
They've all got the ability to contribute, but they're different. And often that they are much more mentally sensitive, and they're bringing different qualities to the organization. So we're at great pains to say, you are who you are. The trick is to make you the best version of who you are. You don't have to change. We have to understand who you are. And so it isn't about making everybody mentally tough. It can't be. We would create an odd society if we did that. We need mixture. And that taps into the diversity and inclusion agenda. We need different sorts of people.
Yeah, and of course, when you say diversity and inclusion, you tend to think of colour or race or gender, and it's not about that, is it? It's about diversity of thinking, diversity of approach, diversity of behaviour. It's about creativity and curiosity and all that other stuff that is almost the most important thing to create an exciting and successful group, team. You need a bit of everything in the mix.
Yeah, I mean, a very simple example is we know that when we look at creativity, and if you look at the World Economic Forum list of the 10 most important qualities for the success in the 21st century, creativity is number 2, right? So we value creativity, but actually there's more than one kind of creativity. So the more mentally tough tend to be very structured about their creativity. They work things out logically and they come to new conclusions. The more mentally sensitive are much more intuitive about their creativity. So if you're serious about creativity, you want both kinds.
Yeah.
You don't just want one kind.
Yeah. This subject, honestly, we're going to talk about this more and more, but for now, I just want to thank you for such a brilliant summary and sum up and little insight into why mental toughness matters so much. And if you'd like to find out more about mental toughness, there's more information, more podcasts available at these links.